I'd like to welcome and call on Professor Wang Binghua, one of China's most distinguished archaeologists and the Director Emeritus of the Xinjiang Institute of Archaeology, who's with us tonight and indeed with us in this university for 2 months. And he's going to offer some thoughts on what he's heard today and indeed on the excavations at Xinjiang province that he's taken part in. He will be translated by a member of the Department of Chinese Literature and Language, Sophie Wei. So if I might call on Professor Wang Binghua.
非常感谢普林斯顿费城大学变成了那个博物馆了。主任给我一个邀请，也感谢那个维克梅尔教授的盛情邀请，让我有这么个机会到这儿来学习，非常感谢。
Thank you all. First of all, I would like to extend my greatest gratitude to University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, especially to my gratitude to the director. In addition, I would like to thank Professor Mayer for his invitation. This is really a great occasion, and then I can learn from all of you. Thank you.
这个一天的会议确实也学习了很多学者从非常宏观的领域那个谈了欧亚大陆古代文明中的许多很重要的问题。
Today is really a fruitful day because I learned from a lot of scholars, especially I learned from their broad horizons from plenty of disciplines.
比如吐火罗语言，它的起源地、它的发展跟中亚的关系。
In addition, I also learned about the origin and development of Tocharians, especially its relationship with Central Asia.
马的巡演、马车的发明。
In addition, I also listened to some speeches related to horses and also chariots.
小麦、燕麦，它们的种植、传播。
Other speeches also include grains, including wheat and millets.
欧亚草原游牧人他们的移动，对欧亚大陆很多古代文明的影响。
And also learn about the influence of those steppe people.
这些方面都给我很多的启发，开拓了我的思路，非常感谢。
I'm really inspired by all these people and their speeches, so I'm really grateful for their speeches and today's conference.
我也非常高兴地听到，在这样一个分析过程里边，不时地提到，在新疆东部地区那个小河流域。 那个孔雀河流域的一些古代的重要的遗址，比如古木沟、那个小河，因为这些遗址呢，我曾经有的是亲自发现，有的曾经参加过工作，能够发现这些遗址在人们的研究里边那个有所获益，也感到非常高兴。
Today, I also listened to some speeches in which I learned that some of the researchers and scholars have already participated in the excavations of some of the ancient sites, including Gumugou. They are in the eastern part of Xinjiang. Actually, for those excavation sites, in earlier days, I have already participated in some part of the excavation sites. So today, when I listen to those speeches, I'm really very happy because I know right now these researchers and those people who are involved in those excavations are starting to do these projects and find these sites.
那个受知识面的局限、视野的局限，我没有这么一个宏观的思路。但是对于古木沟、对于小河这些墓地出土一些文物的细节，倒是做了一些比较细致的、比较具体的观察。这方面呢，跟前面各位学者提到的许多问题有些是可以呼应的。我这里可以谈谈我的想法。
Compared to the broadened views brought up by the researchers today, maybe I only have limited views. However, I involved and participated in the subjects of excavations in Gumugou and Xiaohe Mudi, and some of the results of my researches also correspond to the result of the previous researches. So today, at the end of today's conference, I might be able to share with you.
在来到费城之前，我曾经完成了一个小的研究，就对小河墓地、古木戈墓地里边出土的许多文物上面显示的对7这个数字一种特殊的崇拜做了分析。
Before I came to Penn today, actually I finished a small-scaled project. It is also according to and based on the items found in Xiaohe and Gumugou, and actually these results reveals the mystery of the number 7.
有数十个细节可以表明啊，就是在青铜时代，也就距离现在4000年到3500年前，那个在孔雀河流域啊，这古代居民啊，他们对7这个神秘数字是具一种神秘的崇拜。
Actually, 4,000 to 300 years ago, in this area, according to the items excavated from these sites, we can find dozens of details which are pertaining to the number 7.
很多方面都可以看出来，他们对在7这个数上面记述对太阳的崇拜。
And according to the items we found, we can find that the number 7 is actually related to the worship to heaven.
他们在许多巫术活动过程里边，都要通过7这个数字来记录他们的思想。
And their activities of shamanism are actually related to 7, and 7 is a number which will record their activities.
在经过一段时间以后，这个7呢，已经成了他们一种美的符号，在很多装饰品里边，那个都可以看到7的痕迹。
As time passes by, from those items you can also see that the number 7 has become a part of the decoration.
这是一个非常有意思的现象，因为这个7啊，把7作为一个跟一个神秘的意义联系在一起啊，是个世界性的现象。
Actually, it's very interesting because number 7 is also applied into other civilizations in other parts of the world.
在黄河流域的传统观念里边，有7天造人这种观念。
In the legends spread across the Yellow River area, actually the number 7 is also widely applied.
这跟2河流域曾出现的观念是一样的。
It is also commonly used in the region of Mesopotamia.
这方面的例子随手都可以找到很多很多。
This kind of examples are widely found and used.
我们现在这需要考虑呢，就小河这个地区啊，它的历史是绝对年代是比较早的，是青铜时代，就距离现在4000多年前的一个遗存。这个7啊这么普遍的存在，它跟周围世界、跟亚洲东部、亚洲的西部、欧洲其他地区对7的这种神秘的内涵，彼此的关系怎么样？是一个源头向四周扩展呢？这个源头在什么地方呢？还是这不同的地区啊都有了这么观念呢？非常值得分析。
It is very interesting because Xiaohe, those items excavated from Xiaohe, which is related to the number 7, actually it could be an origin because it could be dated back to the early age in Bronze Age. And this kind of result was also found in the eastern parts of Asian civilization, such as Russia. So is this kind of excavation and also the result is a kind of origin? So this really needs further research.
我只是举了小河墓地啊、古木戈墓地的一个例子，相似的例子很多，比如说对牛的崇拜。
I only bring up one part of my research today, like the number 7, and actually other parts of my research, just like cows, can also be researched.
对蛇的崇拜。
And other parts include like the snakes.
对麻黄的崇拜。
And also Infidra.
就是类似的细节还可以举出很多。
other details in this research and excavation also needs further research.
托老天爷的福啊，因为这个新疆地区是很干旱，无论是古木沟或者小河，这些遗迹啊都保留得非常好。
Due to the good condition of climate in Xinjiang region, actually it is a very dry area, so a lot of items were well preserved, and it is really good for the further research.
它跟古代的文献记录不一样，它从来没有经过后人的增删呐、润饰啊、改造啊，它是一种原始的，没有经过任何改动的那种遗存，因此呢，这些细节就更有研究的价值。
Because it was not altered, deleted, or added, therefore these could be very precious materials for the future researches.
因此，我就有一个想法。如果能够将许多宏观的一种分析，跟对这些遗址比较细致的一种细节的剖析能够结合起来，我们对欧亚古代文明早期人类文明史在距离现4000年到3500年前这么一个时段上面，他们的究竟的情况怎么样，也许可以得到一种新的认识、新的启发。
Therefore, at the end of today's conference, I have my own small suggestion for every one of you. Based on the broad horizon brought up by all of the researchers, I think with those broad horizon, actually we can also add more in-depth and detailed researches, combine the broad horizon and the detailed researches, and maybe we can bring more inspiration for the future researches in this Central Asian region.
这是经过一天学习以后啊，得到一点点新的。
After today's fruitful conference, this is what I have learned from all of you.
希望我们将来在无论是小河，还是古木沟，或者是欧亚文明史的研究里边，通过这样一个结合呢，能够展开新的意义。
It is really my sincere hope that with all of our concerted efforts, we can bring more results to this region, including Xiaohe, Gumugou, and the whole Central Asian region.
最后还应该再谢谢滨州博物馆主人们盛情的接待，谢谢大家，耽误大家时间了。
Last but not least, I would like to extend my gratitude to the director of the museum again, and thank you all for your listening. Thank you very much.
谢谢。
I'm afraid that Philip Cole was unable to be here tonight, but we're very fortunate to have Chris Thornton, who's going to read out Philip Cole's remarks. Chris is a contributing scholar in the Asian section. He specializes in Eurasian metallurgy and prehistoric Iran in the Gulf, for which he received his PhD from Penn 2 years ago. And he's now a program officer with National Geographic Society, and as you heard from Colin Renfrew earlier, Chris is published on this theme as well. So we're lucky to have him here tonight. Christopher.
Thank you very much. I'm honored and obviously quite humbled to be reading Professor Cole's statement and to be among such distinguished colleagues. It's really a dream come true in many ways. I've changed the pronouns in his so you understand what's his voice, and I've interjected a few things. I spoke with Philip Cole just during the break, and he's doing very well. He sends his apologies. He sends his best to his colleagues. He wanted especially to send a very big thank you to the organizers, particularly Jane Hickman. Tina, our events manager, does a fantastic job, and of course, Director Hodges. And he's, again, apologizes he could not be here. He'd also like a disclaimer that he is not, in fact, an expert on the Silk Road. He has never, in fact, been to China, although he hopes to get there later this year. Of course, it's been a long day with many stimulating and provocative papers. Thus, he didn't want to go on very long, and I shall try to stick to that. He wants to make a few general comments and observations briefly on some of the papers, hopefully to help our director initiate the question and answer period. Professor Cole wanted to start with a question that Colin Renfrew alluded to in his title Before Silk. and that is, when does the Silk Road really emerge? And how does it qualitatively change over time? Professor Cole wanted to begin his comments with two quotations. The first comes from Daniel Wa's very nice summary article, The Silk Roads in History. Note the plural, as in the original, Seidenstraßen. In Daniel Wa's article, appeared a recent issue of Expedition. He states, quote, "The history of the Silk Roads is a narrative about movement, resettlement, and interactions across ill-defined borders. It is also the story of artistic exchanges and the spread and mixing of religions, all set against the background of the rise and fall of polities, which encompassed a wide range of cultures and peoples about whose identities we still know too little," end quote. The second quotation is one of Professor Cole's favorites from the renowned physical anthropologist Ernst Houghton. Quote, "When two or more groups of humans come together, they may or may not bleed, but they will always breed." One can perhaps add to Houghton's observation that they will also look at each other, see how they're dressed, and observe other items of their material culture, and they may somehow even try to communicate with one another. One of the endless attractions of the Silk Roads that connected at some level East and West Asia is the mixture and hybridity of cultural traits and technologies manifest, for example, in the marvelously intricate textiles found on the Xinjiang mummies, as you'll see in our exhibit, and of course discussed most readily by Professor Barber. Peter Brown wisely reminds us to avoid two potent mirages, as he said, in our fascination with the Silk Roads. The first is to view them as a, quote, "conservatory of exotic mutations of Western forms of art and religion," end quote. And secondly, to treat them as a kind of early form of globalization, to be understood principally in economic terms as a, quote, "corridor of trade." Rather, interaction along the Silk Road created a, quote, "magical middle ground in which rulers and aristocrats met in an environment carefully constructed to be a world out of this world." When did such careful construction and cultural mixing begin? Is it appropriate to refer to a prehistoric Silk Road, or is that concept in some sense anachronistic or indeed a contradiction in terms? Was the Silk Road the same in the Bronze Age as in the Iron Age? How far back can we push it? Elizabeth Barber documents the technique of weft twining on the Xinjiang textiles that is first attested in Central Europe during the Upper Paleolithic. Was this technique transmitted across Eurasia in very early times, or was it independently invented in widely separate contexts? Don't misunderstand Professor Cole. He doesn't believe that we can talk meaningfully about a Paleolithic Silk Road. However, Colin Renfrew and Michael Fraschetti's papers document connections in the form of the spread of domestic plants, such as millet and wheat, between East and West Asia that may extend back at least into the Neolithic. A similar case of such borrowings or spreads can be made for metals and metalworking technologies, wheeled vehicles and horses during Bronze Age times, as discussed by David Anthony. But how systematic and integrated were these early connections? What did they amount to, besides the borrowing sharings of certain technologies? Reference to a Bronze Age world system incorporating both West Asia and East Asia is, he believes, mistaken, over-exaggerating the extent of interaction and integration that existed and that is documented by these borrowings. Were such early borrowings spreading predominantly west to east, as much evidence would suggest, or were they, like later times, multi-directional? To paraphrase the late Andrew Sherritt, whom I believe was quoting someone else, the Silk Road for the West was the horse road for China. The point is that when the real Silk Roads emerge, they are already a network of complex multi-lane highways, along which materials moved in multiple directions. As Joseph Manning discussed, long-distance trade, one mechanism, along with gift exchange and others for the movements of materials along the Silk Roads, typically means something is being exchanged for something else. This movement of materials need not be perfectly balanced, but typically consists of goods moving in different directions. Now, I was recently very privileged to go with two of my Penn colleagues, Wu Xin and Professor Holly Pittman, to Xi'an for a conference last fall, and in fact they took us to Xinjiang, which was a really wonderful experience. And I'm just interjecting this because we saw sort of two sides of Xinjiang. We saw the sort of oasis culture, the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, the Taklamakan Desert region. And it is what I'm used to in Central Asia and Turkmenistan and such. But they also took us to the Jungar Basin, to northern Xinjiang, which is really a continuation of the steppe. And I raise this as an interesting point of discussion. Professor Renfrew raised this, the issue of the steppe road versus the Silk Road, and how those are perhaps two different ways, and I know Michael Fischetti talks about this, different ways of West and East interacting, two very different systems, networks. I just wanted to throw that in there. Back to Philip Cole. When does such contact become more structured and regular or systematic? And can we document this for later prehistory or on the basis of archaeological evidence alone? When? During the Middle Bronze Age, with the spread of metalworking technologies and mobile herding economies across the Eurasian steppe, or only later, during Late Bronze Age or even Iron Age times? What qualitative changes occurred after late antiquity? Peter Brown hinted at a substantial qualitative change in the nature of cultural interconnections with the advent of Islam. It would be nice to discuss more fully how the comings of Islam reconfigured the very nature of the Silk Roads, and perhaps our own Professor Renata Hollid could comment on that. Now, two scientific pathways that may hold the answers to many of these questions, and here Professor Cole is striking at what I'm most interested in. One of them, of course, is the spread of bronze and copper metallurgy. Professor Mei Jianjun in Beijing has demonstrated very clearly that the origins of metallurgy in Xinjiang come clearly from the steppe. Now, the new question in studies of Eurasian metallurgy is how did it then go from Xinjiang, or did it, to central China and in fact to Southeast Asia? This is one of the most hotly contested questions in the study of ancient metallurgy, especially in Eurasia. And we're very lucky here at Penn to have a number of scholars here today, in fact. Joyce White and Elizabeth Hamilton, who are here at the museum, are deeply engaged in this question, as are many of our guests today, Vincent Piggott, Jim Yulee, Andreas Hauptmann, and others who are here today, so hopefully we can have a discussion on that. The second pathway that has been mentioned a lot by our speakers today is, of course, the use of genetics, something that I have dabbled in. And of course, I think Jim Mallory spoke very passionately about his concerns with the use of modern DNA to work backwards into the past, modern populations. But our own Tad Shore, who responded to that, would be a very good person who works on this here at Penn. And of course, if you're interested in the study of DNA as they relate to these mummies, especially ancient DNA, Spencer Wells from National Geographic will be here on April 17th, so I encourage you all to come to that. Finally, there are questions concerning the state of our knowledge or understanding. The papers told us much about what is known today about contact between East and West. But how complete is our understanding? How much have we learned in just the last quarter century since Victor Mayer and others brought these marvelous artifacts to the attention of the world? There are still many discoveries to be made, and we have to be flexible given the many examples of single sites that can change everything that we know. He gives as an example Sarazm, a Neolithic and early Bronze Age site, which completely changed the way we understood Central Asian relations with the Near East and, of course, with Western China and the steppe. So what don't we know? Can we somehow assess it or compensate for it? There are a lot of peoples out there in Central Eurasia who speak a lot of different languages, as evident in Victor Mayer, Jim Mallory, and David Anthony's papers. But do we know them all? As Jim Mallory admits in his expedition article entitled Bronze Age Languages of the Tarim Basin, quote, "Of course, totally different languages, rather than just Khotanese, Saka, or Tocharian, may have been spoken by these populations, especially if they were derived from native Neolithic groups, whose languages did not survive into the historical record. This caveat reminds Professor Cole of Dennis Sinor's cautionary observation from the 1998 publication of the last Penn conference that Victor Mayer put together, that, quote, "The mummies are mum when it comes to determining the languages that they might have spoken. One can neither prove nor disprove the Indo-European, let alone the Tocharian connection. For all we know, when still among the quick, these mummies might have been using a non-European Indo-European language spoken by Europoids," end quote. Now, Professor Cole wants to leave you with this thought. He recently returned from a 6-week trip to the Northern Caucasus, the most ethnically diverse area by far of the former Soviet Union, with peoples speaking various Turkic, Indo-European, and for lack of a better word, Caucasian languages. How and when did they get to the Northern Caucasus? Are some of them relic populations of much more widespread and significant peoples who formerly inhabited Central Eurasia? How many peoples have simply vanished from the historical record? When we find Caucasoid mummies in Xinjiang, aren't we jumping a bit blithely over time and space to identify them unproblematically as ancestral to the Indo-European speaking Tocharians? The peoples from the Northern Caucasus are also classified as Caucasoid, he puts in quotes, yet few of them speak Indo-European languages. As we all know from introductory anthropology, race, itself a very problematic concept, language and culture, however positively they correlate with one another, are nevertheless remain independent variables. However, one must admit that race, language, and culture often do correlate positively. After all, one tends to exchange genes with someone that one can converse with. Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes or so before the reception, maybe a little longer, to have something of a discussion. I guess the first thing to ask before we delve into the Tocharians is, when do we think the Silk Road really did begin? It actually seems to me Philip's question is quite fundamental, because Michael's paper was enormously detailed about the archaeology of such a site. At your site, Michael, I wonder if you could illuminate just a little on your sense of the changes that lead ultimately, or indeed do they lead ultimately, to what Peter Brown called the road of glass.
That's a really difficult question, so I'll do my best. I guess I'll preface it with the idea that the thought that I really like from Professor Brown, and that was this idea of an early globalization. In fact, I use that exact same concept in my book to structure what I think is the nature of interactions in the Bronze Age. And so it's something that, in fact, we wouldn't have been able to do were we not doing this in the 1990s. Were the Soviet Union to have opened up in, sort of, say, 1980, globalization wasn't really what it is today. And so our ability to look back as a contemporary, with our contemporary view of the world and its economic structure, and apply that to what may have been going on in prehistory, or in fact certainly in historical times, is quite compelling. So to come to the question of Bigash or sites like it that may fit into this broader puzzle, and Sarazm certainly is one of them, I think that there are elements of what we might imagine as a Silk Road-ish type of interaction. But I think what's important is focusing on those smaller local populations who in fact continued through time. We oftentimes have this view of Central Asia as a vast void in which populations come in and come out, bringing with them sort of pockets full of stuff. And in fact, one thing I've learned by working pretty much throughout most of Central Asia and in Xinjiang is that as soon as you think you're alone, there's always someone nearby. And so you could be, I won't even tell the story, but catch me later and I'll tell you the story of how this happens. It has to do with swimming in a river. Anyhow, but the tale here is that as dispersed as the population density may appear to urbanites, I think to groups who were situated in that environment, their connections were real, they were marked in the landscape, rock art, we have stele, we have a variety of other kurgans, real monumental establishments that show that we are here. And I think that those are the markers that allow us to, at least conceptually, extend backward some of the ideas about the Silk Road. And Bigash fits into that only perhaps because of its early date and the fact that as a relatively humble site, it provides an incredible array of pretty much of material that will never find its way into a museum, but hopefully will help us to contextualize some of the beautiful things that we do find in the museum. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but I'll pass the baton hopefully to someone else. Thank you.
I wondered, David, did you find Michael's analysis, which is rather different from yours? How did you find that?
About the question of when the Silk Road began, I would say that before you can have a road, you have to have a foundation. And so the Silk Road, as it's normally conceived, is a classical and post-Hellenistic, I think, phenomenon. But the foundation for it was laid in the Bronze Age. And I would say about the time that Michael is talking about, between 2500 and 2000 BC, there were major changes in the way that cultures were distributed across the Eurasian steppes, a subject that was a little late for my paper. But starting really around 2000 BC with Andronovo and Srubnaya, there is a similar network of cultures that goes all the way from the Black Sea to the edges of China. And that's when I would say the foundation was laid. A lot of networks of connection begin to appear all the way across, so that, for instance, chariotry goes into China, jade shows up going the other way, wheat goes into China, horses go into China, and at that point, innovations are flowing back and forth across the Eurasian continent. Before about 2500 BC, I would say, except for that northern steppe path where things were beginning to percolate, there wasn't really a connection all the way across.
But I wondered, David, just to follow that up and to bring Colin and Michael in a little further, but to echo what Peter Brown said, in a sense, Peter gave us a wonderful description from a world, the so-called migration world. I'm sure he was brought up in migration archaeology, which he didn't refer to at all. He gave us instead a picture of a world of diplomacy and of kings meeting and warriors meeting and offering objects, glories was the word he used. I wonder to what extent, if what we've heard from Xinjiang and what Michael was excavating, these ritual deposits, aren't an illustration of the same kind of glories that on a very small scale are being moved in this pre-globalized society, and to what extent, therefore, these big movements of people can really now be so readily justified. There I've been provocative.
I agree with you, I think, and I agree with Professor Brown's paper. Is a wonderful paper in that sense, that these, what we see as very large movements really resolve down into these dyadic relationships between people who are trying to establish political connections or dominance, power relations with each other. So yes, I would say that those kinds of political relations and dominance go way back. But didn't cohere into a single fabric of connections that had any kind of real permanence until much later. But for instance, the spread of chariotry, if I could just give a quick example, it's always fascinated me that chariots were organized in China in units of 5 or 6 that were supported by large groups of infantry. It's an odd way to use chariots. And according to the Mitanni records in the Near East, they were also organized in groups of 5 or 6 that were supported by large units of infantry. And I just wonder if in between there wasn't a tradition of organizing chariots in these small groups that could then be combined, ultimately when they got to states, into very large armies. Now, if there's an echo of traditions like that, military traditions, that are being diffused from one end of the continent to the other, that's an extremely significant result. It's just a suggestion, though, because we have no documentary evidence for exactly how chariots were being used in battle in that vast space in between.
I wonder, Colin, are you a little more persuaded by horses now or less persuaded by horses?
I think we have to be specific about when we're speaking of. I think the discussion risks falling into anachronisms, which I don't think have prevailed during the day. But I think if we're too sweeping, not only geographically but temporally, then we will combine things that don't need to be combined. I think first of all, the main thing I would like to say is that it's a wonderful feeling that a new field of archaeology is beginning to open up. I feel that with Xinjiang, and indeed what we're referring to as the Silk Road, though that means different things at different times, it's really only now that the archaeology is beginning. I mean, there were those wonderful explorers that we've been speaking of at the early 20th century, and at that time, that was really before archaeology in the excavating sense had really begun in many places. It was before it had begun as a serious discipline in China, and it's wonderful what's happened over the past 20 or 30 years in Xinjiang, which has been the focus of our discussion. But it seems to me that we really do lack a very great deal. It seems to me inconceivable that there was not a population in Xinjiang continuously for many thousands of years before 2000 BC. And the earliest dated things we have, we've been talking about them today, wonderful excavations, but we have to find the earlier places. And when we were discussing about modes of life, there must have been seasonal movements, local seasonal movements. So I think there's an urgent need to look in the foothills and look at some of the cave sites and shelter sites that must exist. And then we'll get a time depth in Xinjiang province itself, which is currently lacking. And I think that will be very helpful, because then we shall know a little more about the pre-Shaohe population, which I think clearly must have existed. And that will make us a little bit less prone to thinking about everything in terms of coming from somewhere else. And I think the prehistory of Xinjiang will very much be a prehistory of Xinjiang, even though it's clearly at a focal point for movements. And so I look forward to that development. And when we have a couple of decades of fieldwork of settlements and cave dwellings and so on, cave sites in Xinjiang, then we'll be much better able to discuss what is local, which we don't yet have documented in our hands anything much before 2000 BC, and what comes from outside. Now, you asked me about the horse. I thought David Anthony gave a wonderful and clear discussion of the archaeology of the horse, and I don't think, not that I'd be in a position to add to it anyway, but I don't think I'd seek to add to it in any way. When he's speaking about Indo-European matters, I might take a different interpretation. Indeed, to be explicit, I think the story he told us was the story of the origin of the Indo-Iranian branch, the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European languages, which he described with great coherence, but that really wouldn't work if we were talking about the Indo-Europeans in general. If we looked, say, at the Celtic lands, I'm not sure, he wasn't talking about that, so we can't criticize him for not dealing with it, but I'm not sure that it would have very much to offer. And so I feel there something is emerging in a very clear way, and I was very interested to hear what Michael Frachetti was saying about the mountain route. The trouble is that when we speculate about the origins of the Tocharian language. Sadly, until we get some evidence for languages closely related to Tocharian outside of the Tarim Basin, then we're really just talking of clouds of smoke, as it were. But maybe one day we shall find inscriptions. I don't know what kind of inscriptions. It's a great disappointment that there's so little on the Iranian plateau in the way of inscriptions. That, I think, is the great sorrow of the Indo-Europeanists at the present time. And maybe if you could just find a little more of these tantalizing seal stones that one finds at Gonua Tepe, but remain obstinately silent. If you just have one or two inscriptions there, then we'd be very much the wiser. So I think the risk is that the Indo-European debates, particularly as regards Tocharian, may remain just debating points until we get some more evidence that has a bearing there. But I think I begin to feel that that's the way I would be looking, as I hinted, and as Michael has encouraged me to think further. I would be looking down to the south, not only to the west, but to the southwest for Tocharian. But that's obviously entirely speculative. But I think the advance of the horse has been remarkable, and I very much enjoyed and totally happy to defer to David Anthony's paper in that respect.
It sounds, Colin, as though you're resisting the blandishments from Jim Mallory and the charm offensive. I wonder, I can't see Jim because of the lights, but I hope you're there somewhere. I wonder what you made of Michael Fraschetti's wonderful paper. I know you're somewhere there in that mass of lights. Notwithstanding the fact that Colin's tried to be very courteous about it.
Colin and I are always very courteous. Regarding Michael's paper, Michael's suggestion, I think the first thing is I have to deconstruct. There are actually two things operating there. One is the origin of the Afanasyevo culture, and that is one thing. That is an archaeological problem. As to, is the Afanasyevo problem an expression of the easternmost migration of steppe populations from north of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea, as far as the Altai and the Yenisei. And I would have said, hooked within the same agenda, if we do the connections with the Jungar Basin as well, as seeing those as established, it's all part of the same thing. Now that's one problem. I'll come to that in just a second. The second problem is, does any of this have anything to do with the Tocharians? And that is a second problem when you try to put a linguistic spin on whatever interpretation you're doing. Regarding the origins of the Afanasyevo culture and Michael's presentation of the evidence of it, and one, I think you've all seen the map that shows this incredibly long trek to explain the Afanasyevo culture from the steppe. And that really is a hideous thing. I mean, there's no other way of playing that. That is not the type of a thing I think any archaeologist wants to look at, is to sit there and draw an arrow that goes for 1,500 kilometers, and there is only one pit stop on the entire way in Karaganda, and it's not an early pit stop because the burials there are actually, they seem to be well advanced. So it really is. You're caught between, you know, a really difficult thing. And I'm the first person to admit that. On the other hand, to argue, I think, is, you wanted some action, right? Okay, you're going to get it. To argue, I think, as Michael said, or I think was suggesting, that the Afanasyevo culture is the easternmost expression of his mountain highway to the east, I think certainly among Russian archaeologists, that was going to be a really hard sell. Because what I saw were pie charts of animal species being used as an argument for the movement of populations, cattle, sheep, goat, things like this, and horse. In Ireland, we've got 3 decent late Bronze Age settlements. I know I excavated one. All 3 would produce a totally different pie chart for the animals. By and large, so far as I can see, your subsistence is going to be on the basis of what works where you are. And you might have started out predominantly loving cattle and hating sheep, but if you arrive in a place in which sheep are going to keep you alive and the cows aren't, you're going to wave goodbye to the cows and you're going to ship to the sheep and vice versa. The part that was missing from that particular argument is any reference that I could see to the material culture, to the burial rites, to the behavior, to ceramics, the metals, and everything else. And all of that really does look like it's coming from the Russian steppe. It's pretty well the same bloody pottery. It's the same burial rite, essentially. It's the same, metalworks and things like that. Consequently, the only way to get around it is to have the economy come one way and the material culture and the spiritual behavior coming the other, and then they're meeting up, far on the eastern fringe. So, sorry, I can't buy that.
I guess I'm being baited, so I'll have to jump in. For argument's sake, I actually, for this talk, I really wanted to talk about the wheat. That was really the exciting thing. I thought that in this venue, it would be something that most people hadn't seen since it was just published. There was an alternative agenda, an ulterior motive, so to speak, and that was to introduce the idea of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor, which is a paper that I've now presented a few times in other venues. In fact, I presented it at Harvard about a little bit over a year ago, and maybe one day afterward, I got an email from Professor Mallory that said, someone in the audience said that you were telling us that the Afanasyevo came from the south. What gives? And so I was thus caused to send him more information. And so he's being coy. He knows that I do have some evidence in the material culture. It's as scanty and as annoying as the evidence from the West, however. And that's why I looked to the economy to see if I could find some homologies between those populations. Because at the site of Sarazm, there are round bottom pots with horizontal designs. There are bodies buried in flexed positions that have stone fences. The excavators there, in fact, refer to these and they date to 3,500 BC. These are sites that I didn't come up with the interpretation of them, though when I visited the site and spoke with the archaeologists who did, they said these are Afanasyevo type burials. So that's in Sarazm, that's in northern Tajikistan. That's that last dot, that 3,500-year-old dot at the southern end of my quote-unquote corridor. This got me thinking. I said, okay, well, what else can I do, seeing that I have a site that's a little bit later, plugged in between at 2,500, albeit not quite the chronology I need to have. So I said, what kind of evidence do I have in between there? Do I have any archaeological evidence? Well, in fact, I do. There's a few forms of ceramics, like 6, which, I'm not going to write a book on it, I promise. There's 6 pieces of ceramic that I have that look like late Afanasyevo, for sort of early, Akuniev, which would be the successor population to Afanasyevo. And so it's got me thinking. For this reason, I am now, in fact, in 1 month's time, headed to Uzbekistan to test archaeologically the exact project. I'm working in the mountain corridor, trying to find out if, in fact, my theory holds water. And one of the great things about archaeology is that however far apart our interpretations may be, we actually have the opportunity to test them. And so if I don't find anything, I'm working about 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers to the north of Sarazm, in the mountains where I think pastoralists would be. And what I ultimately think is that these are folks who are living in the mountains, learning how to adapt to animals in the mountains, that mountain people don't change a whole heck of a lot very quickly. If you look at those adaptations throughout the mountain corridor, they're very long-lived. In fact, 4,000 years long-lived at Bigash. So I don't think populations start off at 3,600, migrate 1,500 kilometers to the west, to the east, and in the meantime, change their economy 100%, while all the while bypassing a community of people who have 99% horses without losing at least 1 sheep, and then say, oh, we get to the mountains, let's figure out a new economy, and then all of a sudden change. That does seem a bit difficult for me to swallow, which is why I'm looking to other answers. That being said, I may very well be wrong. And I think that that's the whole fun part of this, is that And I think that unfairly, perhaps, David and I are being pitted at some level to have sort of these alternative interpretations. And in fact, I benefit very much from the sort of depth at which David has explored the thing, the sort of step model, because without it, I wouldn't have provoked any thought in my own mind. However, there are some things that I think don't match up, and so looking at the animal genetics, which I know that we've now thought about new ways of achieving, looking at some of the other lines of evidence, it's worth testing, especially since, worth testing the mountain corridor, especially since in later history, we see the Silk Road taking that path. So if we use historical analogy with any sort of valid assignment, then we might benefit from the geography we see in later history and say perhaps those foundations, as David referred to them, which I think is the great word for it, those foundations may have been much earlier. How extensive, how coherent, until I started excavating in eastern Kazakhstan, the Andronovo culture didn't exist until 1500 BC. And so one site can, in fact, shift the chronology, and all of a sudden, one has to explain why there are pastoralists with a full Eurasian package at 2,500. That doesn't match with the model. So we sent off the radiocarbon dates, and that's what they came back as. And so I had to sort of justify how this is occurring. So I'm kind of stuck, in a sense, with data that doesn't match, and I think that's the exciting part about the next generation. And I'm really glad that I can sit here and have this conversation with such distinguished scholars, because the last meeting that was here in '98 or '96, I guess it was, I hadn't even been to Central Asia. So you can imagine, how quickly the world has changed and how rapidly this information is allowing us to reformulate an enormous piece of prehistory. And I think that that's probably the take-home message. Whether I'm right or wrong, or whether or not the mountain corridor is provocative or not, I think probably I'll have to hand this microphone to my graduate student in about 3 or 4 years and say, what's wrong? Let's have an argument about your model now.
Jim, I don't know if you want to reply to that.
No, the one thing I would say is that regarding the sheep, just to clarify, in fact, when you hand me the bones...
Yes, I have them with me, in fact.
Right. we are actually working together and on the DNA from the livestock, because that would, the great thing about this is this is a testable hypothesis. And once I get the sheep, I'll be giving it to my number 2 son to bring down to Trinity College, Dublin, which has the Smurfit Institute for Genetic Research, which specializes in the genetics of livestock, particularly sheep and cattle. And one way or the other, one of us is going to, hopefully, at least in the future, find out where at least the sheep were coming from, which will be certainly, extraordinarily interesting.
Sure. I know David wants to...
I just want to put horses back into this. One of the things I find interesting in terms of Michael's idea, and what we're talking about here is how Western people found their way east. So this is a really basic argument. The corridor that Michael talks about, I don't think of as a corridor, and I think corridor is a misleading word if you take it as far north as the Altai. I completely agree with you as far north as Bagash when you're going up to the Tian Shan. But there are no horses at Bagash 1A. And there are no horses in Central Asia in the natural fauna. When you look at what they're hunting in Central Asia, at Sarasa, 3500 BC, and in Bactria margiana later on, they're hunting onagers. The horses are not part of the native fauna. Wild horses didn't make it south across these massive deserts that separate Bagash from the Altai. And I was just talking with you, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this more, tigers. I'm interested in tigers because I think that tigers were possibly the reverse side of that mirror image. Tigers were in the south, but didn't make it to the north. And there is this tremendously difficult line of deserts that separates the northern end of what you're calling a corridor from the southern end of what you're calling a corridor. I completely buy what you're doing at the southern end, but I think the northern end was cut off, and I think the fact that wild horses didn't make it across those deserts is an indication of how serious that barrier was just ecologically. So that's another problem in bringing the corridor all the way up to the altar.
I'm supposed to stop this, but I'm going to ask one last question. I'm going to... Okay, very quickly, Michael.
I actually hope that what you just said is absolutely true, that somehow Afanasyevo, if it shows up that the DNA doesn't work out, that way I can still have some semblance of validity. I can say, yeah, well, I said it only, I went to Bigash anyway. If not, then something else. But that's a possibility, and the horse question is an important one. The amount of horses in the Afanasyevo burials, however, is exceedingly low. And so we're talking about such a patchy record, it's literally like 2 horses, or like two chunks of horses. So it's not a huge amount of horse as you see in the West. So we're talking about relatively patchy assemblages, and by comparison, the assemblage at Sarazm and Bigash, where I absolutely agree, we wouldn't expect to see horses at that time, are quite complex, quite big assemblages by comparison. So, yes.
So I just wanted to ask Peter Brown one last question, and then we'll have our reception. This morning he smiled and he seemed so overjoyed, as he said, of listening to these archaeologists like rhinos, it's a zoological theme again, charging wonderfully at one another. I wondered, Peter, from your heady heights and your magical world as a historian, thinking, as we've heard, of what one would like to see archaeologically for prehistory, what would you like to see us as archaeologists do to help throw more light on the Silk Road from the world of late antiquity? Is there anything we should be doing and finding, notwithstanding rhinoceroses and tigers?
I actually don't know. What I think would be enormously helpful, I'm thinking of this in very general terms, for both late antiquity, for early medieval Europe, and by extension to the Silk Road, is to theorize a little bit more what human movement is. I think that certainly my own study of the barbarian invasions in the West has led me to the feeling that the notion of barbarian invasions and of the ethnic identities that come with these invasions are based on an extraordinary belief that human populations are stable in their natural state. And it seems to me that this may not be true, that movement is actually more normal than stability, and that therefore to make too rigid a distinction between stable populations and then people who bring things in probably is a legacy from a very oversettled Europe of the 19th century, which even modern experience of Europe shows to be extremely thin. That anyone studying the population history of late 20th into 21st century Europe is aware that movement is much more natural. Even Slovene bears, I'm told, are entering Italy now that the Iron Curtain has gone down. I was very shocked to meet a Slovene bear in the Trent Valley, and then I suddenly realized this was a very 19th century reaction.
On that zoological theme, I'd like to thank all our speakers who've really done us proud. It's been a truly wonderful day. I think we've all feasted on great talks.